A couple of weeks ago, I decided to do a tier list in my live stream, ranking all the Kingdom Hearts titles, including the final mix versions, released so far all the way up to Dark Road, and decided to give a full analysis on what ranked where and why. So here's a unbiased take on all the Kingdom Hearts games ranked from the best titles to the most unnecessary titles to understand and enjoy the story. Also, these will have obvious spoilers for the finale of Kingdom Hearts Dark Road, just FYI. So let's start with the best titles. For me, the best titles were what I consider the foundational games in the series, being the first Kingdom Hearts, the final mix version, Kingdom Hearts 2, and Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep. I typically rank the final mix versions of the games higher because they gave that much more to the game's story. But I do believe Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix was the most objectively best and cohesive game out of the series. It was released not too long after the first Kingdom Hearts, and while it introduced a new subplot of the story and introduced hours of gameplay, it didn't add so much that it was too convoluted and people would be lost in the story or give up playing before the end. Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep was very much integral to the entire story and gave a greater understanding of the Darkseeker saga and how exactly we came to know Xehanort as the big bad of the saga. Birth by Sleep also introduced us to the concept of important key elements to the story, such as the Keyblade War, the Keyblade, and a more nuanced understanding of how darkness can affect the heart. It was one of the darkest stories in the Darkseeker saga, and I believed a lot of fans appreciated the full story of this game and just how that ended up impacting the resolutions we saw in Kingdom Hearts 3, which we'll get to in a minute. And then we have the original Kingdom Hearts, which I split between the final mix version and the first release, just because we got a little more of the story in the final mix, and the battle system was a little more user-friendly. But overall, it would be remiss not to rank the game that started it all at the top, because of how the story of the Destiny Trio, Sora, Riku, and Kairi drew us in, and took us on this journey as we explored and battled Heartless and Darknesses throughout the lenses of our favorite Disney worlds. And of course, the ending boss fight, in movie, and secret movie left us wanting for more. Now we move on to the titles that I consider great, mainly because they were more story heavy, starting off with my personal favorite, Dream Drop Distance. While we already had a game in which you could play as both Riku and Sora with a chain of memories, Dream Drop Distance made the stories of the two more intertwined as they explored their way through the Mark of Mastery exam. Not only that, but there was just so much detail at the apex of the story, as Xehanort revealed the means to an end for our hero's entire journey so far, and this was basically the game that should have given some sense of an aha moment of what we could expect from Kingdom Hearts 3 and what each game before now was leading up to. And for what it's worth, while the drop system took some time to get used to, I did believe it was a good way to keep the story progressing between Sora and Riku throughout the game. For Kingdom Hearts 3, I know though there was quite a lot of controversy when the game first came out because it felt like something was missing or incomplete, and that seemed to have been rectified for the most part after the Remind DLC release. So overall with Remind DLC, I do think that Kingdom Hearts 3 fulfilled its purpose of being a game of resolutions. If fans have followed each title since the first Kingdom Hearts, it was such an experience to see so many resolutions play out throughout the Keyblade graveyard and even witness the return and the repentance of Ansem the Wise. Not only did Kingdom Hearts 3 resolve so much of the Darkseeker saga, but it also presented a completely new mission and problem with Sora's disappearance at the end, which I don't think anyone really saw coming until maybe the Keyblade graveyard battles. But I do think Kingdom Hearts 3 gave that opportunity for fans to dive back into the lore and ask more questions, not only about Sora's whereabouts, but the world of Unreality and the Master of Masters and the Foretellers as we wait for the upcoming games. Kingdom Hearts Dark Road gave additional insight into how Xehanort grew up and began his path to become the Darkseeker. But what made this mobile game a great story is that it continued to interlink Xehanort's experiences with overarching elements in the story like the Keyblade War, the pure willful darknesses which may explain Vanitas' existence from Ventus, and now the child or children of destiny who are meant to save the world from falling into darkness. Not to mention Dark Road continued to introduce nuance in how exactly one can fall to darkness and pointing out that things aren't always as black and white as they seem, which we see with Xehanort's progression throughout the story. Kingdom Hearts Union Cross was another great foundational story, but to me wasn't quite as foundational as the games I listed in S tier, but still important enough to the overall story and a great standalone story at that. The chapters in Union Cross tell the story of both the Foretellers and the new Union leaders, and how the fall of Daybreak Town occurred. I think one of the most important things Union Cross did was introduce the concept of a limited interpretation of time travel, as we see the new Union leaders had the ability to travel to different world lines during the fall of Daybreak Town in the arcs, as well as the Master of Masters' full plans to defeat the Willful Darknesses, and just how intricate those plans really are, and why we're likely going to see even more of that in the future games now. Now we're on to the titles that I consider were a fun time to experience. Again, they weren't really that foundational like the previous tiers, but they did play a role in the overall story and were still a good time. So I'll start off with Kingdom Hearts Key back cover, which overall is my favorite of the HD cinematics to watch because it highlighted the relationships between the Master of Masters and his apprentices and gave us a better understanding of why the foretellers engaged in the Keyblade War. I think the most important thing we took from back cover was learning each of the apprentices' roles and just how literal each apprentice took their role in tasking, which, as we saw, later played into them participating in the Keyblade War. We also see just how back cover related to the epilogue of Kingdom Hearts 3, when the foretellers reunited when Luxu summoned them once more. Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories is the first game where we got to play as both Sora and Riku, but unlike Dream Drop Distance, we had to finish the game as Sora before we got to play the game as Riku. Overall, Chain of Memories was a fun experience and a good way to introduce some of the members of Organization 13, although it seemed that Riku's story was a little more pivotal since we also got to meet Ansem the Wise, disguised as Diz in this section of the story. So Chain of Memory was a fun filler that gave a lighter introduction into Organization 13, but not quite the fully fleshed out story that we later got with 358 over 2 days and Kingdom Hearts 2. And now for the titles that definitely had important elements to the overall story of Kingdom Hearts, but were just okay. And that's mainly because it's unclear whether the gameplay itself was really worth the payoff of that particular story. So starting with Kingdom Hearts 2 358 over 2 days, which tells the full story of Roxas's time in Organization 13 while Sora ventured into and fell asleep in Castle Oblivion. While this story did give much fuller insight into Organization 13 and more importantly Roxas, as well as introduce Roxas, Axel, and Xion as the Seesaw Ice Cream Trio, the main payoff of the story seemed to be learning that Xion was created from Sora's memories, and using her friendship with Roxas along with her returning to Sora as a plot point to have Roxas leave the organization and start his own path, which we saw continued at the beginning of Kingdom Hearts 2. And much of that critique for Kingdom Hearts 358 over 2 days goes right into Kingdom Hearts Recoded, where the main payoff of the story was towards the very end, where Data Sora and King Mickey discover Sora's nature as the key that connects everything through his ties with Data Nominee, Roxas, Axel, and Xion, as well as the three figures, Terra, Ventus, and Aqua, also tied to Sora's heart who need his help. More of the payoff was seen in the end credit and epilogue scenes that were building blocks into the future games, with Mickey's conversation with Master Yi and Sid, and Ansem the Wise's apprentices waking up to their original forms after their Heartlesses and Nobodies were destroyed. But again, it's unclear whether all the gameplay in revisiting old worlds like Wonderland and Agrabah were really worth this payoff. And finally, we get to the titles that were not bad, but I'm not sure if they were necessary to move the story forward. So let's start with Birth by Sleep Fragmentary Passage, which is really a short playthrough of Soma Aqua's time in the Realm of Darkness. While the game itself wasn't bad, we didn't really learn all that much except that Terra's heart was fighting against the dark hole Xehanort had him in, and that Mickey tried to save Aqua in the Realm of Darkness, but Aqua sacrificed herself to stay in the Realm of Darkness to save Riku, who was lost in the Realm of Darkness at the time. I will say that at the time of its initial release, it did play its part in showing off the newer Unreal Engine 4 graphics and got fans excited for Kingdom Hearts 3 as it continued to build onto the story. And now we've come to Kingdom Hearts Melody and Memory, which again was not bad and actually a great blend of nostalgia in a rhythm game, while also showcasing Kairi, who to me hasn't quite gotten her full time to shine as a playable character in Keyblade Wielder, although we got a great taste of that in Kingdom Hearts 3 Remind. However, we only really got the payoff in one scene that detailed a little bit about Kairi and Xehanort's past, as Xehanort was a researcher at the time, and the end scene with Kairi, Riku, and the fairy godmother talking to the nameless star and realizing that Sora was in Quadratum. Although the last scene in which the heroes got assigned their new task did have me hope for either an in-between game or a prologue for Kingdom Hearts 4, where we can have a Kairi training montage under Master Aqua. So we got some things from this game story-wise, but I'm just not objectively sure if a game was all that necessary, despite the fact that it did offer some nice nostalgia. So now I want to know in the comments below, what is your take on some or all of these Kingdom Hearts titles, and were there any games that you thought were great or even unnecessary for the overall story? As always, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel if you enjoyed this video and want to see more Kingdom Hearts content. And be sure to send this video to anyone who may be interested in learning about these or future Kingdom Hearts games. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.